Association?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you present recently at one?
Last one.
Okay.
This
Yeah.
Central City recovery stuff.
Yep. Yeah. I was on the board, so yeah.
That is quite the active group these days. Just you as a wrangler.
We are. Yeah. Getting a lot done
Yeah.
across differences of opinion and everything.
Yep. Yeah, I had done 2 years ago. We did Old Town, Chinatown, and recovery activation strategy. Carl was still at that first. And was still the same person.
Right. Yeah. I've been on the board since 2019. So a few years. Mhm.
That was fun.
And I guess the-
Acknowledge
goes back to
uh,
there.
for,
Planning school
trail,
days when I
gate,
worked for the neighborhood coalition.
Ellen's,
Was really liaison to
everything that's a fresh.
Yeah. It's a great part.
Well, luckily we don't have any.
Hey,
Right, so you're never off.
Every Saturday. Higher.
All right.
Okay, good afternoon.
That's
Welcome to those joining us in our library. Welcome to those zooming in. I'm Cy Adler, Interim Dean of the College of Urban and Public Affairs. And welcome to another in our series of panels inspired by the 50th anniversary of the Portland Downtown Plan, within which Portland State University was designated an urban university, which we understand as a university that is in and of its place. Panel today, housing in neighborhoods, one of the original goals in the Portland Downtown Plan, 1972. So I'm going to introduce the moderator, Dr. Matthew Gebhardt, Associate Professor of Urban Studies and Planning in the Toulon School here in the college. Before coming to Portland State, Professor Gebhardt taught planning at University of Sheffield in England and has returned recently from a Fulbright Fellowship in South Africa, where he's been studying development-related issues. Professor Gebhardt will introduce his panel. Panel members will present, then talk amongst themselves, and then we will open it up for questions from those joining us in person and those zooming in. Matthew.
Great, thank you very much, Cy. Really excited to be here and really excited about the fantastic panel that you've got today, both here and online. So I think I'll start down at the far end and work my way this way. We have Troy Doss, Senior Planner with the Central City Team, the Portland Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. He's been with the city since 2000, so lots of institutional knowledge specifically related to downtown and Central City, where he was a project manager and managed many of the core areas of the Central City 2035 plan. He's a graduate of Cal Poly Pomona and joined the city after working in private practice and for numerous government agencies in California and Oregon. Next to Troy, we have Tyler Bump. I was a senior economic advisor and project director at ECONorthwest. He oversees projects on land use, planning, real estate, investment, and affordable housing. I joined ECONorthwest in 2019 after just under 8 years, I believe, as an economic planner for the city of Portland. He has a Master of Urban and Regional Planning degree with a focus on community and economic development from the University of Colorado, Denver. Next, we have Mary Rain O'Meara, Senior Director of Community Development at Central City Concern, where she oversees design, financing, and development of new affordable housing projects. She's a 2019 graduate of the MERP program here at Portland State University and has worked at Central City Concern since 2018 after working positions with Human Solutions and Clackamas County. She's also a board member of the Old Town Community Association Board since 2019. And then we have Jason Franklin, Associate Vice President for Planning, Construction, and Real Estate from PSU. He's a graduate with a MERP degree from PSU, and has been with Portland State since 2012 as Director of Campus Planning Office, in charge of a variety of different planning efforts for the university. And online we have Jill Chen, who's the Housing Investments and Portfolio Preservation Manager at the Portland Housing Bureau. Her team oversees a range of programs that leverage investments to expand and preserve the supply of affordable housing. She has an MBA in finance and strategic planning from the Wharton School and has been with the city of Portland since 2014, first at the Portland Development Commission and now at the Portland Housing Bureau. She's also a board member of Micro Enterprises Services of Oregon. So I'm really excited about the panel, and they are coming from a variety of different perspectives. So in putting this together, tried to kind of balance folks who had a view from within the city, from outside the city, from the private sector, but also from the nonprofit sector and institutions like PSU. The idea is that all of these different groups are necessary to actually go about implementing the strategies that we put together. The initial framing that I pitched for the panel discussion was housing in the context of the 1972 downtown plan. And we're going to be considering both sort of the past, the present, and the future in relation to those. And one of the overarching questions prompts I gave to the panel related to their different positions was to sort of talk about the different perspectives that they might bring, again, from within government, within institutions, nonprofit, and private sector. So as I mentioned, the 1972 downtown plan was included an element on housing. In fact, it was actually the first goal in the plan. And while the plan is widely lauded for its approach to transportation, parking, and design, just as impressive was its focus on housing, particularly for a time period where housing in the downtown was seen primarily as a problem to be solved, something that was incompatible with other uses, often deteriorated or occupied by less desirable demographic groups. But the first goal of the downtown plan, as I mentioned, was housing, and it was to give high priority to increasing the number of residential accommodations in the downtown area for a mix of age and income groups, and to provide a quality environment in which people can live, recognizing that residents of downtown and adjacent areas are essential to the growth, stability, and general health of a metropolitan city. And it went on to list several specific items, including public programs to reduce slippage, ensure housing accommodating a mix of low, moderate, and high income people, recognizing the need to meet the needs of various groups, such as older adults, students, folks with experiencing disability, and down and outers, and ensuring that there were accessible services to support that housing, including supermarkets and transportation. So there was a lot going on related to housing in that plan. And so the first question has to do with that kind of history, the past piece of this. And the prompt that I put to the panel was, do you consider the 1972 downtown plan a success with regard to housing? And why or why not? And what kind of factors would you point to for the success or lack thereof? And in particular, kind of moving forward, what lessons we might be able to learn from that. So I think we'll start down at the end with Troy, since you do bring such an institutional knowledge regarding the plan and its implementation. So turn it over to you.
Well, thanks. I would say it's largely a success in terms of what it started to do with housing, and brought interest in downtown again for as a place to live. After the post-war years, the downtown went from almost 30,000 residents down to about 11. So we're going definitely going the wrong way. So I think some of the big projects that got started during that, the River Place, some of the work on the park blocks and all those, great. I'd say though, we started probably one of the things that's a real problem with housing in Central City then and today is it really is more of a market rate and affordable, but there's really nothing in the middle. And there's also not a very good range of housing diversity. So we'll have it's still, I think it's over 80% of the housing downtown consists of studio apartments and 1-bedrooms. So that's gonna be a real problem in the long range as we're trying to accommodate 30% of our growth. So that's, but in terms of getting interest in doing housing at all downtown again, the downtown plan was a great place to start. And I think it started building around the amenities, you know, the amenities that were being promoted by the downtown plan. You see housing responding to those. And that pattern continued into the 88 plan. And same kind of thinking we apply today as we're trying to go forward with, you know, targeting housing in different areas today. So.
Yeah, thanks. Tyler, do you want to go next?
Sure. Every day when I walk into my office, I walk past a plaque that says "We planned it worked." And I don't know if anybody has seen these plaques around downtown. It sort of forces me to think back to the 1972 plan, sort of what my role is in policymaking and sort of city building here in Portland. And really coming to this work as a Portlander first, not necessarily as a private sector person or former city employee, but thinking about it as a Portlander. So, you know, when I look back at the 72 plan, there's one thing that I think is really important to me, and that's the relationship between multiple goals and objectives in the plan relative to each other. Knowing that housing couldn't have been successful without some of the other investments in transportation and infrastructure and social services and culture that focus on the waterfront, how those things are all interconnected, is really important to the success of the 72 plan. As Trey mentioned, you know, reversing the trend of I think what the plan calls disinvestment happening in different parts of the central city was certainly occurred over the following 30, 40 years, 50 years over the course of the plan. So I do think it was successful. I think there's a question of who benefited. You know, there were a lot of tools used at that time that were used in different ways, and I think we would use those tools today. And so I think there's still lots of questions about what success looks like in terms of the 72 plan and where we're going forward from here. But yeah, it's something to celebrate, I think, for all of us that work in this space, and what it did achieve, and think about how we can move forward.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And first of all, a correction. While I would like to be a 2019 alum, I'm a 2009 alum. So a few more years of affordable housing experience under my belt. So speaking from the perspective of central city concern, you know, we got our start in 1979, headquartered in Old Town. So I imagine that the 1972 downtown plan, with its emphasis in housing, helped organizations like Central City Concern get their start, and really with a political alignment with the need. Specifically, we serve folks that are transitioning out of homelessness and very low income residents, find a place to live. You know, we got our start acquiring old hotels, historic hotels in Old Town, converting those to single room occupancy housing. So in that regard, again, I think that alignment, the emphasis on housing for all essentially in the plan, could be seen as a success. A lesson, I think, if you look at Central City Concern and sort of our really, you know, the majority of our housing is in Old Town, right? And that continues to be true today. While we have expanded to other parts of the city, when we look at our portfolio in downtown, we haven't expanded out of Old Town as much as I think would be more indicative of sort of a more balanced approach to affordable housing within downtown. So sort of that concentration rate of very low income housing within a specific neighborhood, it has its benefits, but it also has its drawbacks in terms of, you know, isolation or just not access to a broader swath of amenities.
Thank you.
Yeah, so from, I guess, you know, but first from a university perspective, I would say, you know, you can look around and definitely been the creation of units in downtown. That's been some that were already here as part of urban renewal, of course, and then kind of the new areas. I would say that about that time, I believe, students here at PSU organized to purchase or kind of force the purchase of some of those more derelict properties that were being used by students, right? And so I think a lot of work was happening around both kind of the affordable side there, but also the affordable side here at PSU. In that, you know, fast forward, we can talk a little bit more about that, but you know, PSU is obviously a housing provider, a fairly large provider of housing here in the downtown area. So we can talk some more about that. But I think on the side, it was mentioned a little bit about what wasn't successful. I think as much was the neighborhood creation in downtown. And I think a number of those amenities still are lacking to this day, right? So grocery stores, for instance, just recently we've got a couple of grocery stores, but that, back for a while, there was essentially a food desert here in downtown, right? And and then you look at sort of the park facilities that are available. It's not really neighborhood park facilities, right? It's more regional kinds of draws and that. And so as you think about downtown as a neighborhood and all those things that support the range of different housing you find in neighborhoods, generally, downtown is lacking. Yet we are expecting a lot, right? 30,000 units, but how do you support all those? And we see that here at PSU now, where the green space at PSU is used by the neighborhood because there isn't really any other green space that is flexible and frankly somebody can walk their dog. So those sort of basic things are missing. And I think while it was successful in beginning that discussion about housing, incentivizing housing, primarily I think through transportation, the other parts that make up a good neighborhood seem to be missing.
Jill? Available?
Yes, thanks. I'm sorry I'm on virtual,
Oh, no, no problem.
but it's great to see all the students and to have this conversation. I wanted to sort of leverage off one of the other panelists who mentioned that the 1972 plan seemed largely successful, and you've seen a lot of sort of outcomes from that. And part of it was funded primarily through tax increment and the urban renewal. And you'll see that when we look at that plan of this, sort of downtown core, much of it is actually covered by different districts for urban renewal areas. And one of the things about urban renewal and the use of those proceeds is that there is economic development and there is affordable housing, but you don't have much more support above that which is considered affordable. So you have the bifurcation in the market, because middle income housing does not necessarily pencil. And we all know that as well, especially when you have a downtown core in which the land and the cost of construction is very high. And so we do sort of move along. And I think of the 1972 plan as being successful because at least before the end of the 20th century, Portland has always been a thriving, sort of gem in so many ways. And a large part of it, I would assume, has happened because of the work of the city. And, PSU, all the community, and I think in a large part it's been successful. But then there's a downside, right, Matt? So, thank you.
Great, thank you. I wanted to follow up and see if there were any other kind of lessons learned that we might be able to take forward from this. There's some interesting things about the concerns that maybe came out of it, but are there things that we should be taking forward when we're kind of looking at the next, say, 50 years, that we, don't do this, definitely do that?
Well, yeah, I mean, you need to be intentful about your approach. So the 88 plan, I think, kind of took it to another level, right? So that's when we started getting into the zoning tools and started saying, okay, and mixing it with urban renewal. So you had the development agreements. You also had areas where we were targeting housing, like you were required to build housing of a certain density in certain areas. There's some areas where we didn't want you to build housing, so we would identify that as well. And so we were trying to get at the neighborhood component that Jason refers to. We failed miserably, though, at putting in the amenities that make it a mixed neighborhood. So it's not a big surprise that we got the kind of housing that we did out of it, because mostly at that point, the goal was housing, period. And it's not that different today in a lot of ways. We're not really putting in the parks with playgrounds or active recreation facilities. There's not a community center downtown. There's one library. There's And it's a large area, so you just don't have the kind of things, the kind of components that you would have in other town centers, for instance. You could argue that the Hollywood Town Center, even though it hasn't seen as much development, has more of the amenities that would attract a more diverse population than downtown. That's something we're gonna have to get better at doing going forward.
One of the things as I've looked back at the 1972 plan to prepare for this panel today, is it did a really good job of setting a vision and getting buy-in from a lot of different stakeholders across the city, across the state, to be able to articulate that vision, and then identify some really big projects, infrastructure projects and investments. And so it was really high level. It was focused on the west side of the river, right? So the 1972 plan was only focused on the west side of the river. As Troy mentioned, the 1988 plan to me reads more like an implementation strategy and an action plan where you start to get at a sub-district level and you start to have a little bit more nuance and understanding what the actions are. And if you look at the action items in each of the sub-districts in the 1988 plan, we've done a lot of those in Portland, and there's still some that we're working on today. And so the action plan in the 1988 plan is really, really cool because it's lived for so long and it's done a good job at what it was intended to do. And then the question is, we'll get to the other question about the 2035 plan, but sort of what's changed when we went through the Central City 2035 process, when we think about that now differently from before. But I think that sort of vision and having the conversations around vision, the neighborhood association process at the time, the community advisory committee, the city community advisory committee, like there are a lot of things that sort of helped bring that together at a very important time for that 1972 plan. The one thing that I think that I sort of look at in that plan that I still sort of look forward to in Portland is a waterfront that we can actively get to and touch and experience and recreate in, and as an experience for Portlanders, as opposed to something that we go by and we look at. And so I think that's something that relates to housing, relates to investment, relates to amenities in the central city that just hasn't materialized in the way that I think was articulated in the plan.
Yeah, I would say, planning is a blueprint for our best community aspirations, right? And when you look at project construction and implementation, it really comes down to financing mechanisms. Within affordable housing, Jill Chen mentioned TIF. And so there was an alignment with TIF 1972 plan around how are we going to make this happen from a financing perspective. I would say going forward, lesson learned is really continue to do that and articulate that within the context of planning documents. Set the vision and the guideline, but what are the tools via financing mechanisms to realize these projects? In affordable housing, we love to try to do commercial ground floor, but it's very challenging because the diversification of funding streams is so regulated and difficult to combine. So, I think a little bit of identification of, what are those tools that developers can look at within the context of project implementation. What else can the city and other government agencies bring forward as resources for construction and mixed use development in downtown?
Yeah, I was gonna just to pile on there. I think that as the details that become important, right? As someone who's developing in the central city, going through those regulations, I'm got a lot to say about that, but just from the housing standpoint, yes, trying to do too much perhaps right in one building, right? And you're trying to always have retail on the ground floor, and trying to make that pencil is always going to be difficult. And it's probably not the best policy choice, right? So I think a lesson maybe from the 72 plan was, or going forward, is like, we need to be very intentional about where we're putting retail, where the parks are going to go, where the community center is going to go, right? And land's not getting any cheaper. And so, imagine if the city would have taken some of those TIF dollars, bought some of those properties downtown in 72, and then leverage that to say, okay, here's the type of neighborhood center that we're going to create in each of these different districts, right? So going forward, it's not too late, right? And especially now as downtown's, one would say on the downside and not on the upside, is now the time to, for the city to purchase, right? To say, okay, we're going to invest, knowing going forward, we need to accommodate, 30,000 units or whatever the number is going to be, but setting that up, right? So stuff's not making any more land downtown.
I think one of the other things that planning in my mind, is a fantastic tool. But also, we have outside influences, market forces, just you can call it life in some ways, has a tendency to sort of shift things around. You were talking about us, all of us trying to put everything in a project. And I agree with Mary Rain. I've never seen a, ground floor retail or commercial pencil in any of the affordable housing. As a matter of fact, we try not to have that because, the cost increases exponentially, or cost is very high and you can't pencil it. But also what happens is market forces has a tendency to shift the dialogue sometimes. And, Portland in some ways became really cool, maybe after the 1988 plan. And certainly, I think while we were doing the comp plan of 2035, we had all these goals, but then COVID came in. So we've got all these changes that even if we have a long-term plan and vision, the market forces create tremendous changes. And, some of the stuff we're still working through came from all the different impact from, you can call it the 2008 recession. And even before that, I think the 1997, maybe, you just got these dips in construction that makes housing and sometimes livability in a city very hard to grapple with, because the market forces means that construction is not a straight line. It's these dips and valleys. And how to describe it? It's hard to sometimes manage. You can't manage market forces. You just have to sort of deal with it and go with the flow in some ways.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's a number of different connections to topics that I'd like to pursue. I think maybe the first one to start out with is around the sort of subsequent planning efforts. I think I mentioned this 1988 plan. So the 72 plan put the housing kind of as the first goal. It was foregrounded. Subsequent plans have done more of kind of balancing it off against other goals, maybe shifting a little bit more towards reinforcing office and retail, transportation, or design. And some of your responses to the earlier question had to do with, the types of amenities and neighborhood building and those sorts of things that go around along with the sort of successful housing efforts. So I'm sort of curious if you want to expand on those. How important is housing as a component of the central city, of the downtown, in relation to those other priorities? And what are some of the maybe synergies or conflicts that you see, and how we can play off of those to, kind of build those quality neighborhoods and successful housing going forward? Open it up, whoever would like to start here.
I would say it's more important now than it has been before, frankly. I've been doing a lot of work recently with the city and with Prosper Portland, sort of understanding what the impacts of COVID have been in the central city, where things have changed, where, sort of what the opportunities are to think about moving forward. And some of the more resilient sub-districts have a more balanced mix of commercial uses and residential uses. And then what we're seeing at a sub-district level at this point in time is that those that are much more commercial heavy are those that are struggling a little bit more. And that's, as Jill mentioned, these sort of unknowns and these things that sort of come up, market forces or other sort of shifting things that happen in the world. And so, from a planning perspective, I think, resilience is one of the sort of key components or key aspects of the 2035 plan. And related to that is flexibility, and how do we think about places as flexible places within our central city? And what does that mean moving forward for investments and policies is a really big question. But I think housing is more important now than it was, in the last 20 years, frankly, for the future of Portland. We need housing. I don't think there's anybody that knows that we don't have a housing shortage. All income categories, all housing types, and it's an important part of our city and regional puzzle.
And it's probably the only use that is going to be financeable in the near future anyway, at least for the downtown area. I mean, I think if you look at the downtown sub-district specifically, so the old central business district, that model's dead. It's just not gonna work anymore. And I think the last 3 years has shown that to us in terms of the economy and other things that went south there, but they're having standalone commercial and that's it, and very few residential. It just showed that you can't support the businesses. There's no eyes on the street. A lot of the ills that have come out of that is by lack of having residents there. So that's one thing. That's probably the biggest thing. I mean, we have an opportunity now going forward, just looking at more housing than anything else to get it right when we do it. So we have certain tools we're trying to put in play there, but whether it be master planning or development agreements or other things, but we have the opportunity now to start, as we do these larger housing projects, start bringing in amenities as part of those projects. We could also, as kind of Jason was doing, we could come in and start putting in some of those amenities for banking for them, so hoping that housing will respond to that at time. I think this is an opportunity to do both of those things.
Yeah, I think, speaking from a sense of community standpoint, Tyler, your comments made me just reflect, we have over 2,500 units in the Central City Concern portfolio, but spread throughout the Portland metro region. When I think about our downtown sort of community of buildings and the experience through the pandemic, those were the communities that still felt connected. And then when I think about some of, the East Portland communities that we've built over the past few years, it's been more challenging because there is less of that sort of multi-use, mix of dynamic in the community in East Portland. It's just sort of starting to grow and diversify. And so from just that sense of community perspective, the mixed use, the importance of housing, being connected to other services is so crucial. And there's also, I think, a resiliency factor, right, with that sort of urban experience, right? If you just look at Portland and those dynamics, but access to all those other services are so key. So a lot of our residents don't have their own vehicles. They've got to have access to transportation. So having housing paired with those other amenities as priorities, we can't lose sight of that, right? You mentioned the food desert of downtown, right? That's still very much a reality. In Old Town, we don't have access to affordable, healthy groceries within a walking distance. So folks have to use mass transit. They've got to be able to get to doctor's appointments and, all of the other essential services that they need to access. So, of course, I would say housing is still a #1 priority, but it's got to be balanced with all of those other uses.
Did you want to jump in?
No, I just think it's interesting on the housing side because we might have a tendency to sort of go too far the other way and think about like housing as the solution to everything. And I think one of the things that is also a lesson learned from previous plans is that, our economy and our jobs and our job growth and business growth happens in Portland in a very Portland way. Like we're not a Fortune 500 company town. We have different kinds of businesses. And so how do we continue to allow those businesses and encourage those businesses from a land use, from a real estate perspective, well, not, focusing too much on housing because we still need to do our economic growth. Jobs are the things that allows us to pay our rent, to pay our mortgages on places. And so how do we balance the need for commercial and jobs with residential, given that we are in the place that we're in right now? And so it's going to be a challenge, I think, over the next, 5 years as we on the backside of COVID.
And we've seen examples of where that wasn't done. Vancouver, BC on the peninsula, they got to a point where they had to stop allowing housing to be built. They created office-only zones because they were looking at that base just going away.
I did want to mention one thing about housing in general, and I think, Tyler, you may be the one who mentioned this, is that when we look at housing stock, doesn't matter where you are, in the city of Portland, we have almost a housing shortage across all jurisdictions or locality or neighborhoods. Especially the numbers are very, very stark. I have all kinds of presentations I can show you, but the one that I wanted to just sort of make sure everyone realizes is, except for the units that are, say, affordable regulated units, the downtown core, the little core that we saw in the 1972 plan, That is not affordable, frankly, to any average family of four, to any. And the current 100% median income is $106,000 for a family of four. So the statistics show that right now the downtown core is not available to even the white, you can call it population. I mean, the numbers are stark in that the whole of Portland is not affordable to any average, this is average, single parent, nor to any Black household, average Black household, or to and there's only like 4 neighborhoods that's affordable to the Native American, average Native American household. So we've got a downtown core by nature of just maybe the construction type, the land, accessibility, whatnot, is not going to be a bit affordable to any, you can call it, racial group or ethnic group. So that is an average. Of course, for the, the higher, 25% income levels or, the top 10%, those would be affordable. But I did want to just share that in terms of statistics. So it makes it a little hard when we're talking about neighborhoods and the downtown core, because the cost by itself, I mean, we're not going to be able to fight market. I mean, as much as we like to, there's going to be a certain type of neighborhood that's going to be created in that downtown core because of the affordability or lack thereof. And I think, in terms of amenities and all that, we can, expand the amenities as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's the conundrum, right? I mean, you've got high-rise development costs and the rents that you need to make those projects work are not going to be affordable without significant subsidy. And even I would imagine most of your development, central city concern is, it's 5/1 or 5/2 these days kind of development, right? So stick-built stuff that you're not necessarily seeing in downtown, right? And so how do we do that, or do we get to a place where you can get that enough significant middle income housing in downtown to make a dent in that, or you kind of throw your hands up and just say, all right, let downtown be what downtown's going to be, and the idea is just produce as many units as you can in a targeted way to help take some of that demand up. Those are without a significant amount of subsidy. I mean, I think there are certainly opportunities for middle income housing. There are opportunities here on the PSU campus for it in the surrounding neighborhood here where we could certainly do those things, but it's not going to take a big chunk out of it, right? So
it's been suggested before that we just throw up as much housing as possible at all the market rate and then just take off the taxes and fees, put it elsewhere, which that's not going to create complete communities. So that's one of the things we have to balance, is trying to figure out what's the right approach to that. And so yeah, it's a commitment.
But it still doesn't mean that we can't create a neighborhood or have some of the amenities that make it more neighborhoody. It's I'm on the Portland Housing Bureau, so I only do affordable housing, which is affordable to those earning 60% area median income or below. So for a family of four, that is about $62,000 for a family of four. But that middle income and that which is affordable for, say the tall high rise, maybe there's some other ways that policy wise could make sense, right? Maybe some incentives, maybe some tax breaks, not sure. And maybe my colleagues at Prosper. So Tyler, I'm going to ask you, since you're consulting with Tyler, with Prosper, to think about things like that, because, especially for the downtown core, we may not need so much, you can call it commercial development, because right now, real estate development, because right now there is sort of a surplus of commercial buildings and retail buildings, but it may be something else we can do with the space we have to be built or to be reconfigured.
So a number of things have come up here. One of them is the kind of going back a little ways, the framing in the Central City 2035 plan around the needing to accommodate 30% of the growth and only 3% of the land. But we've also talked about the different types of housing and meeting the wide range of different housing needs, which were embedded in all of the different plans, 7288 plan. So I guess the broader question is, do we have the tools in place right now to meet both the kind of broad housing needs, producing the amount of housing that we maybe need, that we're projected to need, and then more specifically, getting to the points that are being made, particularly around middle income housing? Do we have the tools we need to produce that? And if not, what might those tools look like?
I'll start with the wet blanket approach to it and say, no, we don't have all the tools. I mean, we have mixed use zoning, which allows for anything you want to do. We just don't have the financial tools to it. And it's been noted a couple times here that we're missing that workforce housing component. We did analysis prior to this 2035 plan, and we're looking at what's the workforce income rates and what's the affordability here, and there just isn't much in downtown. Or and I say downtown, I'll say the Central City in general, so east and west side. And then when you get to that next component, what makes you want to live there is it's not just it's the grocery store, and it's the parks that accommodate your needs, access to basic services, it's access to schools, it's access to a lot of things that we just don't have here that other downtown urban centers do have. Some places go after that. And I don't think we really have the financial ability in Portland or in Oregon to really go after those types of amenities so easily. That's going to be one of the challenges to try and accommodate 30% growth. Is what's the character of that growth going to be like? I think we're going to see a lot more of the same for a while until we can find ways to finance that greater mix of uses and amenities that are going to help create, urban communities.
We went through a pretty interesting process during the Central City 2035 plan and looking at incentives in the code. And so we were looking at recalibrating our density bonus system in the Central City. When we started that project, there were 18 different options to access additional density in the Central City. There was 1% for art, there was bike parking, you get a density bonus if you just build housing, period. Like there's all these different sort of public objectives that were adopted as policy or actions over the course of, the last 40 years. And so we started to think about what are we actually prioritizing. A lot of those things that were bonused in the past had incentives became requirements because of the place that we were at that point in time, which is our investments in infrastructure, our investments in real estate are paying off, the market's doing its thing. So we're going to have green building requirements, we're going to have green roof requirements, we're going to have bike parking requirements, we're going to have all these things that used to be incentives are now requirements in the base zones in the Central City Planning District, or the Central City Planning District. The one density bonus that we did keep is now used to offset as the density bonus as part of the inclusionary housing zoning code. So our inclusionary zoning code is the single biggest density bonus of residential mixed use development that we have in the Central City right now. And so absent adding additional density, which is really hard given the cost of steel and concrete construction to add even additional height, I think we're at a point at a regulatory system incentive system where it's kind of hard to think about what's next and what do we do. There are financial tools available. One thing, and Jill, I would love to get your thoughts on this, or Mary thoughts on this, is that TIF and urban renewal has been a very flexible tool with a very complex history. Most of our urban renewal districts are expiring in the next few years. In 2006, the city adopted the set-aside policy where 30% of urban renewal funds go to affordable housing. That money's going away pretty soon. And so how do we fund affordable housing, and what are the financial tools that we're using once our urban renewal districts expire? I think is a really good question, because it's been a very big source of funding for affordable housing and infrastructure to support development, residential and commercial development in the Central City for a long time. So that tool is going to be going away pretty soon. So what are we doing after that? I think it's a good question.
I would agree with you, Tyler. And I think one of the things so far for the Housing Bureau, we've been fortunate enough to have the Portland Housing Bond pass and then have the Metro Housing Bond pass. And I'm pleased to say that actually the Portland Housing Bond was 258 million. The city's allocation of the Metro bonds was 211 million. So out of this almost $470 million, 100% of it is actually fully allocated and or already programmed, meaning it's going to go into some building somewhere in the city of Portland already. And pleased to say the last bit is going to go to the Broadway corridor, which is a downtown site. But I think the numbers, at least for the affordable housing numbers, show that the city itself needs 20,000 more units of affordable housing. Right now, the total portfolio of you can call it regulated, it's only 15,000 or so. So that 20,000, if we just look at the gap, that's going to cost, like, I hate to say it, almost over $3 billion. I mean, it's huge. We're not even talking about the middle income. And how do we address those people who are not going to be in regulated, but more middle income housing? You know, those are folks who may be our school teachers and our firefighters, and they're more middle income. Because right now we don't even serve them in our housing. So I see this thing called TIF cliff, Tyler, you're talking about. And right now, I don't know. I wish we had more for housing. But I'm going to be blunt. I don't see it. I'm hoping something happens because if the production stops, especially most recently, hearing that rent increases for next year, the maximum rent increases will be up to 14.6%. We're probably going to be facing a lot of people who are going to be evicted, potentially even a higher increase of people on the streets. It's not going to be pretty. So I'm not quite sure where to go next for money. Yes, we've got a building issue, and I would love to hear, like, Mary Rain, your thoughts on this, because you and I are in the same industry.
Yeah, so speaking, I'm involved, of course, with the Old Town, the 2 TIF districts there, and we've been working very closely with Prosper regarding the TIF cliff. And what we've seen is that we're not lacking the land, we're not lacking the building infrastructure. What we're lacking now is really a market rate interest in developing in Portland. And so what I would like to see, and what we've been advocating in Old Town, is can we look to the developers that are known and that can leverage investors within the city, because we've got the connections, we have the trust, we know what the realities on the ground are, and start looking at a diversification of affordable housing into workforce with some of the remaining TIF money, because we're just not seeing the market rate developers come to the table anymore. And we don't want to walk away from this resource. Like, the housing and the amenities are critically needed. So what we've been advocating for in Old Town is we've got ideas, we have experience, we have skills, and I'm not just speaking about Central City Concern, just in terms of local developers and local interests. We would like to be collaborative and really leverage sort of our internal knowledge and expertise within the city and within development. So I have lots of ideas, but I would say first and foremost, let's continue to have those conversations and sort of, not hold on to parcels of land with the hope that there will be the next big developer coming to the table, because we're just not seeing the financing and the sort of external interest that we did sort of before the pandemic.
Yeah, I think back to a point Tyler made about our regulatory regime and is of a time, right, when things were successful and we were creating it's sort of a pile-on, right? Because you could all of a sudden, you could say, we can have our cake and we can have our bike parking, we can have bird glass, we can have 100% green roof, right? All of that stuff's now required in downtown Central City. And as a developer for the university going through that, I can tell you it costs a lot of money. And so I was just on a call last week, other folks in the city and developers, and they're all like, it costs too much in the city, right? It just costs too much and capital is not flowing anymore to Portland for, other reasons as well. But when it can go to someplace else and it's a lot cheaper to develop those market rate units and to partner with folks, that's where it's going to go, right? And until we decide as a community that we got to do something about it, and we have to sort of scale back and think, yeah, we did all these things for really good reasons at the time. Now's a different time, and we have to adjust, right? And we have to adjust quickly, because if we don't, Portland's going to see, I think, a 10-year lapse in capital development, which we don't. As soon as it goes, right? I mean, it goes, and it's really hard to get back. Really hard. Just ask Detroit. Yeah. So we don't want to be in that place.
I would agree that the developers I've talked with, and most of them are, affordable, but there are some who do both. And it did not help that Portland became an image of chaos and sort of, the nightly, you can call it, news clips did not help our thoughts. And I've heard people say, yeah, insurance, construction insurance tripled, and it's still not coming down. Things like, people don't want to, sort of waste money in Portland because it's just too hard to develop, right? It takes over a year to get permits. Those are things that impact not only our affordable developments, but development across the board, when the requirements sometimes become so onerous and so expensive. I mean, right now, I think I'm looking at cost average of, between 400 plus to over 500,000 a unit. I mean, at that point, it's pretty expensive, and we're asking developers to take a lot of risk.
And these regulations are primarily focused on the Central City Plan District too. So, I mean, I'm going to just give a little background on it. I'm not lobbying one way or the other, because that would be detrimental to my employment health. But I would say that you purchase a parcel of land downtown. What are we talking now? 20 million?
For an acre, yeah.
Okay, but then you go through design review. That's going to cost you some time and a lot of soft costs there. It's going to take you a delay as well, because none of those go through fast. You're going to have a bird safe requirement for your windows. You're going to have an eco roof requirement, and you're going to be asked to pursue a green building certification. You're going to have to do all of the various bike parking. And then there's that's just out of our code. So those are things that are driving the cost up. So people talk about that. That's the type of things being said. You don't have to go through that to build in any of our surrounding jurisdictions, and even some of our competing metropolitan areas. So there is a competitive disadvantage in some ways, at least from the development community's perspective on that.
I think the important thing to know here too is that, development, it's not development for the sake of development, right? If we continue to see demand for housing, it's going to make housing more scarce and housing more expensive. And so the thing about housing production is that it hopefully at some point continues to meet demand and regulates prices in a way that keeps it from not escalating as fast. And so when we talk about the need to make things a little bit easier or have development be feasible, whether that's for affordable housing, moderate income workforce housing or market rate housing, it's in the goal of getting more housing to have it not be as expensive for folks across the entire city. And I think what I'm hearing here is something that really came up a lot in conversations during the Central City 2035 plan, and that is that capital is fungible, and there's a lot of different perspectives or philosophy on whether or not that's true. And I think what we're observing is that's true. is that there are other markets to go to. There is frankly Vancouver and Clark County. Things are booming in Vancouver and Clark County. There's Boise, there's Salt Lake, there's Tucson, there's Phoenix, there's Denver, right? There's all of these sort of comparison markets for capital sort of flow to that are also facing intense housing pressures. And it's something that we need to think about as we're thinking about the future and sort of where we've been and where we want to go.
And they provide amenities in some of those towns too that we aren't able to provide to attract housing as well. And I think some locales become challenging too. If you look at the Vancouver waterfront, it's pretty impressive what they're pulling off there. And I can't tell you how many people come up to me and say, why didn't we do that in South Waterfront? So our regulations prevent us from doing that in South Waterfront. It was choice and was made for very, sound reasons, but that is the trade-off there. And one of the things we want to look at some point, kind of come back to, is we have a waterfront we can see but we can't touch in Portland, is maybe we need to kind of reevaluate that and see how they're doing it there. Are they achieving the same goals they wanted environmentally in Vancouver that we hope to achieve here, yet somehow are getting more out of that waterfront locale?
Yeah, I
It's
mean,
worth looking into.
yeah, for sure. And back to your point about the 2035 plan, we worked hard to change that and we're not successful, right? When we're trying to better access to it, change that from basically a regional fair that happens and all these big events, right? And it gets walled off for 6 to 9 months of the year. It drives me crazy.
The best time of year.
Best time of year, right? You can't even use waterfront park, which is arguably the greatest amenity, potential greatest amenity in downtown, right? So you should see right across from that, your highest density, your highest rents right there. But if you go down Nadeau Parkway, that's not what you see at all. And so that's a direct reflection of us not making the appropriate investment, or even worse, making really bad policy choices about what we do with that open space. And so here again, I mean, the pieces are all there, right? We've got great transit, we've got a river, right? We're close to all these great outdoor amenities, right? But we just have to say, okay, what's important? What's important now and what's important for the next 20 years?
I could keep talking for a long time. I mean, the waterfront is really interesting because that was one of the biggest sort of investments in infrastructure that was in the 1972 plan.
Yeah.
The removal of Harbor Drive, the investment in the park. There was a lot of plans for activating sort of commercial activities and commercial uses, restaurants and such on Nadeau. And then the whole urban design structure of scale into the river. So there was a lot of thought and intention behind the waterfront, and parts of that were realized, and I think parts of it were not realized. But that part of it is a success story of the 1972 plan, right? We don't have
There's no freeway.
highway,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Directing down
for
the
sure,
middle of the state.
yeah.
So part of it's a success.
So I'm gonna follow up. Oh,
Oh,
ahead.
I think part of the success is, we got the beautiful waterfront park, right? Is now getting the rest of the development in the downtown to sort of catch up. And, I'm because it is expensive to develop downtown, maybe in some ways it's not so bad to just have a lot of rich condos. I don't know. Because, the whole concept is if you build more, because at some point, those people who are at, say, 120% area median income will go and, rent the units that are a little bit more expensive. And those that are 100 will go and rent 120. And then we're all going to be sort of rent burdened or, real estate burdened, right? But at some point, the weight on that, which is, you can call it more workforce, more affordable, might be relieved. And I don't know, maybe I'm wishing for some magic bullet, but I'm just hoping that, Portland has such an incredible asset on that waterfront. And to stretch that out, and you see it being stretched out along, Northwest, along the new developments all the way up. That waterfront is such an incredible asset. We just haven't tapped into it. Same thing for across the river on the east side. There's just a lot of, you can call it, beautiful waterfront that should and could be developed that we haven't yet touched. So I'm hoping that something will happen.
So yeah, I'm going to go off the script a little bit here because one of the things that I'm hearing is a lot of concern about policies and regulations and incentives and how these work together or don't work together. And it sounds like we need to have more conversations about what that would look like to be something that actually was, functional in achieving the goals that we want to achieve. And so I guess the question I have is, where should those conversations take place? Who should be leading those? Who is leading them right now, if anyone? Like what do those conversations look like, and how do we get them started so that we can start addressing these conflicts that you're talking about in terms of, the barriers to achieving what we want to achieve. And I won't call you out, Troy, because you mentioned your employment situation already, but
yeah, I mean, I'll start. I mean, I think, it's got to come from the mayor, right? I mean, that's ideally where it comes from in our special form of government. It's very difficult because you got the mayor, essentially 5 mayors, and all this different policy that's that we see is conflicting and isn't all moving in the right direction. But I think, if I were mayor, and you look at it, you've got to take that charge, right? If downtown becomes a priority and say, we're going to get people together, we're going to reconvene, we're going to talk about policy in a real way. And if necessary, we're going to call an emergency, and we're going to take a timeout on some regulations, right? And see if capital begins to flow back and see what we can do in the short term while we work it out, because changing the comp plans, no small feat, and it takes time, right? But I would argue, in somewhat of an emergency. And in order to see if we can get the capital turned back on, are there some dramatic steps that you can take? And, are those the right things? Because you're gonna have to take some things work, some things don't, and you're gonna have to go back and kind of retool that. But in the meantime, I think you've really someone's got to take charge essentially and say, here's where it's going. And we're going to have this conversation across all the bureaus to say, and it's not, and you're right, it's not only the regs, right? It's I always fear, like, when PBOT sends their, the public works thing, I'm just like, oh God, right? And so that comes over the fence late, and you're just like, holy, and then, your whole project's just like, all of a sudden you got to retool everything because something came up at the last minute, right? Where it's like, how come that we didn't know about that from the beginning? So all that stuff's really got to be addressed, and it's nothing new, and everyone's been talking about it for a long time, but now it's really urgent.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the focus should not just be exclusively on new construction. As a developer that does conversion projects as well, we've seen permitting timeline as long as a year recently for a 10,000 square foot conversion building that was to provide shelter beds. And the sort of just blockages within our permitting system, where it's moving from bureau to bureau, and there could be just one stop that you're not sure how to communicate really, like, the importance of the work you're doing in the context of we're in a housing crisis in our city. And what we see is this siloed operation a lot in terms of functionally permitting and approvals. And so I think that really now's the time. I know that, the mayor and Commissioner Maps are looking at the permitting workforce, and I would just hope that they're bringing voices of developers that are doing all sorts of projects across the city in terms of where are we seeing those stopping points, and how can we accelerate and put more emphasis on a more efficient system.
I think there's lots of great ideas out there. Earlier, Mary Rain said, I've got a bunch of ideas in Old Town.
Yeah.
And those are my ideas. I was like, put those ideas out there. Let's talk about these ideas. But frankly, I think we're due for a new conversation. And where that happens, I'm unsure. PSU, right? Like, we're sitting here talking about it. I haven't been in a conversation like this in the last 2 years. And so I think this is a good venue to be able to do that, but we have to broaden the conversation, and we have to have those as a broader community. But I'm hungry for new ideas, and I think I'm hungry personally, again, as a Portlander, as a place to have those conversations and have those bring those ideas to the table and figure out what is the next thing that we're doing. How are we defining the future of the central city and the future of Portland for ourselves, and especially at this time when we're sort of like, oh, what are we doing? Our personal lives, our work lives, everything's been upended. Let's figure it out. The time's right.
And I would note a couple things too, real fast, just. God bless us, we're a town that has a lot of ideas, and a lot of passions, right? We care about quality architecture, so we have design review. We care about stormwater and habitat, so we have green roofs, we have bird safe windows, we have green buildings, and we have, it goes on and on. We have a lot of wants. And multimodal transportation system, which comes out, and that comes out, development helps pay for that as well, right? So we have all these things, and they're good. Are there ways in which we can do them better, make them more affordable? Maybe we need to look at that. I don't think we want to necessarily compromise on all these things, but at the same time, they're not always applied holistically. They're not looked at what's going to be the overall impact by doing all of these things at once to a broad jurisdiction. So that's a valid question. And also, the downtown plan, it didn't happen overnight, but it did happen in a fairly tighter time frame, as did the 1988 plan than the 2035 plan did. The 2035 plan was initiated by Vera Katz. It went through 5 mayors before it was adopted. It stopped and started. It had a lot of, different challenges and polls and ideas that came along during it. And I don't think it resulted in the most comprehensive plan for downtown. And then it's also was immediately challenged by a global pandemic, major economic downturn, social unrest that none of us could possibly envision. And that's changed the direction for a couple of districts. It's changed it for downtown for sure. It's changed it for the Lloyd. The Lloyd is still on a policy basis supposed to be a retail and office district. That's not what it's going to be. We're going to have to go back and change that already to look at it being more of a residential mixed use area, which gives us a great opportunity. And I guess it leads us to the next concept is, yes, we can come back and challenge our assumptions and change them. The 88 plan was really interesting in that it laid out these different districts, sub-districts, and ideas for them. But opportunities and miscalculations were quickly found in each of those districts. And we went back and we changed the direction for those districts. The River District is a very different district from the River District plan to how it actually even built out all the way through the North Pearl plan than what's on the books in the 88 plan. Same is true of South Waterfront. And I could go through district after district. We went back and we changed our approach. New challenges came, we changed the plan to face those challenges. And when opportunities came, we had a council and mayors at the time that were really pushing us to go to that direction. I think that's conversations are starting to happen again. And I think that's the direction we'll have to go.
I would agree. I think one of the things we found is over the course of COVID, and it's now almost 3 years, our concept of what maybe it's just me. I think the concept of downtown core, what work and what commercial and what retail and how our neighborhoods should look like probably changed a little bit, because I would guess that if we took informal polls of all the offices we're in, the majority of the people would say they never want to go back 5 days a week. I mean, that's what the city did. And the city's employees came back and said, I think it was 80% refused to come to the office for more than 2 days a week. So it's something to talk about in terms of how does that change our concept of a downtown core? How does that change our concept of commercial districts versus retail districts versus where we live? Is that means where we live is the same as where we work and same as where we play. So I think that is probably going to be a challenge for my colleagues in the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability.
It raises another question, which I'd be curious to kind of know your and Mary's thought about a little bit, and probably Jason's is too, is that once again, if we have a change in how we're living and working, and we're doing it in the same place, that challenges our assumptions about the type of units that we've been building. Like if most of our housing stock downtown is studio apartments and 1 bedrooms, that is not a great environment to be working from home in. So what does that say about the future of this housing stock as well? Is that in jeopardy, or do we need to start changing that approach as the development community, the architectural community, and start changing to create spaces that are give you the workspace a little bit separated from the, the living space so that you don't go insane by being there, 7 days a week. We haven't seen that yet.
Yeah, and are there other impacts that the pandemic has had that we need to be accounting for? So, I mean, I know Heather, you had some thoughts on that from earlier.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's an employment loss thing. I mean, we talk about services, amenities and all these things, but for the last 50 years in Portland, it's been a balance of jobs and housing that has supported the amenities and the businesses in the central city. And from 2019 to 2021, we lost 20,000 jobs in Central City. 12,000, 60% of those jobs were in food service and accommodations. And so a lot of our restaurants have disappeared. A lot of our amenities and services have disappeared in the last 2 years. Part of that is due to the fact that we've lost so many employees. We all spend money when we're at work. Only 70% of office workers have come back to their offices in the Central City in Portland. So
How many?
70%.
No, that number's not right.
It's on average,
There's no
on
way.
average, yeah.
There's no way there's
It
70%.
varies by sub-district
Yeah,
because it varies.
yeah, 1 day a week.
It varies by industry,
Yeah.
right? And so we've got a lot of service sector workers that need to be in the office. We've got a lot of social service providers, like we have a diverse economy. It's not just office workers. And so certainly for office workers, it's less than that, I would say for sure. But our demand for those services that support the residential uses isn't necessarily there from the segment that it used to be for employment. So how do we think about that? How do we use our right of way to be able to support that different ways? Are we going to continue to have demand for parking? What's the future of there's a lot of big questions that we need to grapple with, and that's sort of how I got stuck thinking about the interconnectedness of the goals of the 1972 plan. It's because we're sort of back there again. How do we figure this all out? Because it's all post-pandemic, it's kind of intertwined.
Yeah. And that I was on a panel last Monday, we were talking about design and that, and it seems we're at the same point at 72 plan where downtown is kind of hollowed out, right? There's a lot of post-war flight, and now and it was like, okay, what can we do in order to revitalize downtown? And it seems like we're back at that point, right? And I have a lot of optimism about downtown, a lot of optimism about Portland, despite my sort of negative outlook on some things at the moment. But I do think that there's a lot of creative people here. We have a lot of creative industries, a lot of great ideas, and I think bringing those in to have this broad ranging discussion, right? And what does it mean to have retail space downtown? What does that look like? I mean, I personally think we need to take a look at our neighbors to the south, far south in Central America, and what do those cities look like? What their retail spaces, right? And sort of loosen up this idea of what happens on the ground floor, and really think creatively about how we can get some different uses in there. Besides, there's a lot of building code and other things there, but primarily it's the regulations that are kind of squashing a lot of that creativity, I think. What do we do with all our right of way, right? Transportation eats up 30+% of downtown, 40%, right? Do we need all those streets? Probably not, especially if everyone's working from home or mostly working from home. We don't really need, so let's start thinking about how we close down some of that, provide some more amenities, some open spaces, places to walk your dog downtown, right? So I think, so there's, the tools are there. I mean, we can have the creative people, and we've done it before, right? We can do it again. So it's having those discussions, starting those discussions.
Well, I would note that there are people starting those discussions. So there are a lot of, although I know that's happening inside City Hall, I know it's also happening with a number of different groups. There's various players in town who've been coming together, having conversations about this. Some of the traditional players you might guess in the business community, but there's groups of architects right now who are talking about acknowledging that it is the 50th anniversary of the downtown plan, and what are we doing now? What is going on here? Can we go back to that kind of thinking and create something that gives us a good vision going forward? I'm just like the elegant simplicity to the downtown plan. I mean, I'm being on a couple panels, like when I go back and take time to read through it again, it's like, God, it really is a nice plan. And it's simple in what it promotes. It makes perfect sense. It didn't get too bogged down in the details about how to get there. Those happen following that. And we're still, as noted, we're still pursuing some of those, but And I think what we have to constantly find new ways to achieve those goals, though, because like it's been noted over and over again, we can't rely on the same tools anymore. Even if urban renewal is not politically very attractive to most politicians or even most public right now, but even if we tried to employ it, it wouldn't have the same bang for the buck that it did when we started, because we just don't, we're starting from a different tax base. So those tools don't work as well. And now that we don't arguably did not need 18 development bonuses in the code. We should have been shedding some of those off over the years, because some of them were things that the development community just started doing anyway, because it just made sense. Some are things that were values at the time, but we need to go back and kind of start to prioritize. Is there a way to start offering those types of incentives again?
I was thinking about, there's a lot of focus on employment that can be home-based. And I want to call out from the perspective of an affordable housing developer, a lot of the folks that we house are in the service sector. They don't have the option to work from home. So for a lot of them, studios still work. Sure. And I think about, if we look at sort of that workforce sector that doesn't have the option to work from home, that ranges up to highly paid medical workers as well, of which we have at Central City Concern. We have over 1,100 employees. And even our, highly paid medical workers struggle to find housing in Portland. So is there sort of a workforce focused housing policy that could look at, the teachers and the police officers and all the folks that still want and need to be in a community, and, really emphasize housing options? We're talking a lot about missing middle. I think it needs to be balanced with, sort of the 60% up to 120. But I see it as we've got an opportunity to utilize assets that are not functional in the way they had been historically. How do we take that and make it into an amenity that, is still a benefit from a housing perspective or an amenity perspective?
Yeah, and I think of some of those things that we have in our code or in our different plans where we require certain things in all of our buildings, especially if you're on the commercial corridor, sort of ground floor activation, the definition of what is like retail, the definition of what is commercial. Is there a potential for blending those? Because a lot of people sort of live and work in the same place, right? Because now most of us are housebound. So is there that blending, and is there that ability to be a little bit more flexible? So, an artist may be living on a ground floor, but he or she may be a painter as well, and may be selling their art from their home. But is that considered a residential, a retail, or commercial? I mean, those definitions and sort of that ability to maybe stretch a little bit may help us do a little bit more. Because I can't tell you how many affordable housing buildings we have, which is required to have ground floor activation, in which that space is pretty much dead, and it's just quote unquote commercial space, not commercial, community space, because we can't put anything in there. We can't really put a commercial in there, because then we would be considered a partial commercial building. So does there any kind of flexibility there, not only for affordable, but for potentially for also the market rate developers that might stretch that? Or can we do some other things, be it, if we're requiring, say, certain green features, we give them a break in terms of something else? Just some ideas.
So, I have a number of other potential questions to ask here, but I want to make sure we leave time to open it up to the audience for questions as well. I guess one thing to kind of lead us into the audience conversation that I'm interested in, and this goes back to something that I see one of my colleagues, Dr. Horst, in the audience here, and recently I wrote a chapter for a book on housing in Oregon. And, you know, despite the fact that there's a lot of really interesting things happening here, a lot of very interesting, innovative ideas, the chapter came out pretty pessimistic at the end. And one of the responses from reviewers is, well, what are the points for optimism? You know, where can we be optimistic here? And I guess I'm curious. Yeah, I know, Jason, you mentioned that you were optimistic about downtown, but what are the points for optimism, and especially kind of looking longer term? I mean, we're kind of retrospectively looking 50 years behind, but like 50 years into the future, perhaps. What are the points for optimism, and what maybe could we imagine seeing from the downtown?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, 50 years from now, the world's going to be a much different place. It's going to be a lot hotter, right? There's going to be a lot less water. But the optimism for this area is that we're going to be, well, even though it's going to be hotter here in Portland, it's not going to be as hot as the Central Valley or the desert Southwest. And we've got a giant river, Columbia River, that's probably not going to dry up anytime soon. So I think there's going to be a giant migration of not just people, but also of where we're growing our food, right? And the folks that are going to follow that, right? So you drive down the Columbia River, you know, now, and go to the Gorge Scenic Area, get to the end, and it's where we water it, it's green, right? And so it's like the Central Valley to me. And that's kind of what, in my vision of what's I think is going to happen, right? Is look there. So what does that mean for Portland? Portland becomes, I think, a lot bigger than we planned for. Like the number of people coming to Portland, I think we're probably under planning at this point. And how do we set it up then to sort of say, okay, how are we going to welcome these folks? How are we going to make this city grow into something that makes sense in the, you know, the 25 to 50 year future? So, and, you know, earthquake aside, I think there is a lot of upside here in Portland when you think about our geographic location.
Yeah, we thought about climate refugee going forward. It was a discussion during the 2035 plan for sure.
Yeah.
And I think you're right that we do have, one of the things we do have is because of the Oregon land use structure of having urban growth boundaries and preserving farm and forest land. We have set ourselves up for food growth in the future, which will be good. We know right now that the main investment that's probably going to occur for the next decade in Portland, at least in the downtown and Central City, is going to be housing, not office. So that gives us opportunities to try to leverage things as well. So I mean, there's going to be continued interest in there. And despite all the bad news about Portland, people are still moving. That has not changed. So investment has gone away, but people haven't. They keep coming. So
I could say lots of things. I mean, I'm generally an optimistic person, regardless of like how much I wave my hands around when I talk about things not being as good as it could be. But you know, I think sometimes we think about the central city or the downtown, we talk about it as like a monolith, and there's lots of really interesting things happening at the sub-district level. I'm highly bullish on the Central East Side, like the Central East Side, the mix of employment, the addition of additional residential units over the last 10 years has made it be one of the least impacted sub-districts from the pandemic. And I think, you know, how do we think about resilience at a sub-district level or at a block level? What does that mean is really interesting. I also am optimistic about the way that we're thinking about larger development projects. So if you think back to the 1972, 1988 plans, you know, we've got the north of Burnside, Northwest Warehouse District, which is now called Pearl. And then we've got South Waterfront, but we're doing things different now. And so we've got OMSI, we've got Broadway Corridor, we've got Albina Vision Trust. And I think a lot of the thinking around large site redevelopment and large site development is different now than it was before. And that's definitely optimistic. AVT especially, I think is fascinating and really a model for us to think about in sort of large development sites and what decisions we made in the past and how do we reconcile those with the way that we're making decisions now. So I think there's lots of things to be optimistic about. You know, I spend a lot of time, I live in North Portland, but I spend a lot of time downtown in the Central City. And it feels different now than it did, you know, in 2009. It feels like cities did in the early 2000s or the late 90s. There's stuff happening. That sort of creative innovation thing that you can only feel and see at, you know, 1 o'clock in the morning or whatever it is, that is happening again in Portland, and I'm optimistic about that.
Yeah, I'm like Tyler, I'm energized by being in the office. So I'm in Old Town 5 days a week. And what I see very optimistically is what are the opportunities that come from downturn. So what we're seeing in Old Town at the neighborhood level is a lot of minority owned businesses and folks looking for affordable rents, not just on the housing side, but on the commercial, on the retail side. As a neighborhood, we've been very active in recruiting and really making that sort of what could be painted as a dire situation into an opportunity for growth and regeneration. We have, you know, businesses that are now seeking out coming to Old Town because they're saying things are happening there. We want to be part of that. We see change on the horizon. Also, I have to just say, as a mom of 2 kids in the Portland Public School, I love over the weekend, my son was like, I'm really a city person and I can just see myself, you know, I want to be in a city. And I'm like, we're doing something right if we can, you know, be focused on planning and the future of the city and have children in our public schools that still have optimism here. So, you know, again, I just think there's that opportunity that comes out of economic downturn or whatever you want to call what we're experiencing. And we've done it before. So I think back to the 1972 plan, Central City Concern 1979, started taking buildings, revitalizing those. We've done it before as a city. We've got the tools and experience. We just need to make the functions of city government and permitting timelines and all of those other things work with us. And then look, you know, to partner around the resources like TIF and all of these other financial mechanisms that can help us do the work I think we know how to do.
I would agree. I think, I mean, I may sound like a downer, but I'm really very optimistic about Portland as a whole. And I think part of it is also, I do agree that we're going to see more influx of people because, you know, California, sort of the shift from the south, you know, influx of Californians coming in is it's just going to continue. It's continued sort of unabated for a while, but also in terms of for the downtown, I think there's a lot of energy from the community about wanting to do something and doing something that will make it not just bring it to what it had been, but potentially bring it but better and doing something a little different. And I'm also seeing the city as a whole, we're not, you know, a lot of the, I think, earlier plans focused on the downtown core. There are now also efforts to look at what is the neighborhoods looking like. So it's not just the downtown that we're, you can call it reviving, but the spurs. Where are the outer, you know, where's some of the other developments going? And so as a city as a whole, I think that's very exciting. So.
Thanks. Be interested in opening the floor up to the audience. Yeah.
Got a question. My name is Brandon. I'm a graduate of the MF program and also a coworker at Central City Concern. The question I have is hearing some of the issues that have been discussed today. You know, you talked about the tip cliff and the drop off of funding there. You talked about the underutilized, maybe underdeveloped public amenities that we have in the downtown area. You know, lacking park space, as well as some of the onerous fees and regulations. I don't think I heard explicitly called out, but like SDCs are a big impact in development here. In the conversation, a lot talked about it as a major issue. And kind of thinking back to the 1972 downtown plan, and then maybe the impact that the statewide property tax limitation had in the early 90s. There's also the mention of underdeveloped, underutilized properties, and I think you saw a bunch of development in the industrial areas of the Pearl District, South Waterfront, Central East Side, but you still see a ton of surface parking lots lining the streets. You see a lot of single-story warehouses and commercial buildings that have not been developed, like I think the downtown plan or the 2030 high plan anticipates. And I don't know what will happen anytime soon. Short of overhauling our tax system, statewide property tax system, like how do you see overcoming those issues of funding public amenities as well as incentivizing or demanding development of those underdeveloped space?
Yeah, so. Thank you.
In my head the whole time, it's like, there's so much underutilized land and our property tax system has not incentivized people to develop their properties. So how will we deal with that?
Yeah, so that, yeah, the core of the question, thank you very much for summarizing it there, is that we did talk at a number of points about underutilized spaces, surface parking lots, single-story structures, those sorts of things, and the need to develop those, and particularly within the context of statewide property tax limitations. How do we go about actually getting those into productive use?
I can talk about infrastructure for a second, because I think ultimately a lot of your question rests on infrastructure funding. And I'll sort of put a shout out to OHCS, who has we have a draft report out with OHCS looking at SDCs and infrastructure funding across the state right now, which is a ask from the legislature last year, and the impact on housing production, and housing prices and affordability. So there's a really cool report, very long report that's up on OHCS's website that you can look at SDCs. But along with Measure 5 and Measure 50, on the infrastructure side was a big reduction in federal funding for infrastructure to local jurisdictions. And so the SDC and the infrastructure piece, even from an incentive, like SDC waiver perspective, is really hard because we have to pay for infrastructure somehow. And our infrastructure looks okay when you walk around, but there's a lot of stuff under the ground that is past its prime in terms of capacity or needs additional investment in terms of capacity. So I think there's a big question of how do we fund infrastructure? Frankly, I think that's a statewide conversation that we need to be having about infrastructure funding. That's what TIF has been used for when, very often is infrastructure. TIF goes away. We still have to fund our infrastructure. SDCs are still there. It's our primary way of funding infrastructure in the state. So what do we do? So I think a big conversation around infrastructure funding needs to happen.
So just to follow up, are you suggesting that part of the limitation on developing these sites is the lack of adequate infrastructure, or?
Sometimes it's an infrastructure constraint issue that leads to the way that we fund increasing the capacity of those systems is through SDCs, which in turn creates challenges for development feasibility. SDCs are across the state range between $0 and $55,000 per unit. So there's a wide range. Portland is on the upper end of that range, not the top of the range, but the upper end of the range. And that's expensive. That's affordability in terms of a unit, whether that's a rental unit or an ownership unit.
And the infrastructure is what made the Pearl and South Waterfront happen. And it's, at the time, it was probably the least sexy thing that the Portland Development Commission wanted to put money into, because it's harder to see. You wouldn't see those districts about it, but that wasn't the most visible thing. It wasn't the thing the press looks at either, looking parks and affordable housing. They're looking at new sewer and water lines. But that's what makes it happen. And Central East Side is booming. It's a great place, but it has one of the worst sewer systems. And it will only take a small earthquake locally to really make the infrastructure needs in this town show up fast.
Yeah, I think partnerships too are a way to begin to overcome that. So like here at the university, we're sitting on 5 acres at least of land that we can put into housing, right, with the right partner. And we're beginning to look at that and to see, okay, how can we get middle income housing here at the university? Because we have a huge problem with employees, right, that are moving further and further away. Students are moving further and further away because they can't afford to live in the central city or anywhere close by. So that's a kind of active discussion that we have ongoing to see if we can do a prototype of a smaller development and then move it into scale it up here at the university. So, but I think partnerships are valuable. We just finished a big partnership building with HSU City and PCC. So I think bringing folks together to do these projects is really what's required, especially when the land that's left is sitting there for a reason, right? So in many cases it's ownership, but in other cases it's just difficult because of infrastructure or other reasons. So.
Yeah, I was going to mention, I think it is starting with some of the publicly owned land. So we see, Prosper has some land holdings that could be in that, essence of partnership. Some of the infrastructure funding contributed into the development pro forma funding stack. I like the idea that the mayor's put forward of the land bank. I question feasibility of the 400 sites, but it's ambitious, it's a start. And I do think that that public-private partnership is going to be pretty essential going forward in terms of, can there be some of those costs carried into the development?
We have a question for Zoom. You would mind calling on Michelle. So you can hear you up there.
Great, thank you. Been told to Michelle, you have a question.
Hello, everyone. Great discussion to listen to. My name is Michelle McKinnon. I am a student at PSU and I'm taking an urban planning class. Big ups to Professor Horst. I had a question beginning with the premise that the metrics chosen and how their data is expressed can shape a result, either towards efficacy or failure, right? Depending on how, they can be, data can be manipulated with all the well-meaning intentions in the world, right? But with that in mind, my question is, how does the urban planning effort in Portland determine which metrics to use in measuring a plan's success, such as the success of the 1972 plan or the 2035, and how are those metrics evaluated for, relevance to the communities or people it serves, and the impact of it not working or working, and equity. And with equities, I mean specifically passive bias, like discrimination of low expectations, things like that. So how are the metrics chosen? What's your process? And then how do you, how do you measure them for these important goals?
Okay. So yeah, the question had to do with metrics of success. So how are these metrics chosen? How are they evaluated for relevance? And in particular, how do they connect to pursuit of equity?
Well, the equity ones would be harder to hit, but typically the plans will have metrics associated with them, adopted into them. There's not as many in the 2035.
I'm so sorry. Could you say your name? I'm sorry.
Troy Doss with the Bureau of Planning Sustainability.
Troy, hi.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you.
So our plans will often have metrics associated with them, adopted into them. More often than not, it's going to be action items that are adopted into the plan. And like when I think Tyler mentioned this earlier, when you go back and evaluate like the 88 plan, we figured out that we hit about 75% of what we said we wanted to do now. And other ones just we didn't hit them because they maybe just became passé over time. Like we didn't do a butterfly conservancy, something like that, Often urban renewal plans will also have targets. So X amount of affordable units at certain median family income levels. So there's various ways in which we will hit that, and those are pretty easy to check off, whether you've hit them or not. The equity metrics, we're still trying to wrap our head around what does that mean in the central city. Is it access to affordable housing? Is it access to family housing? Is it access to education? Is it access to jobs at different levels, whether you're education levels and income levels? So we hit those kind of, we target those things, but I'm not sure that we have firm like numeric targets for them. So we'll go back and evaluate where we're at. Often if we feel like we're not getting in the right direction, we'll go back and try to tweak the tools we have to better achieve those. Some varying success.
One of the
Okay,
best,
so in a dearth of, something to measure or a goal to hit, who decides to what extent that a plan has been successful?
Well,
Like, what does the 75% mean? You know what I mean?
yeah, well, that was just an evaluation by staff to say, we said we were gonna do all these things in 88. How do we do? I would say though that what is considered a metric for things like affordable housing, for instance, that the need changes over time, right? It's become greater than it was at one point. So I would say whatever our target was in different plans 10 years ago, they're probably not anywhere near adequate. And who evaluates it? Whoever's in charge at the time. I mean, quite honestly, I mean, the politics of it, they're going to change a little bit as well. So, I mean, and I don't mean that to be facetious. It's values, our societal values change over times too. So if you look at each of these plans have been adopted since 88, you look at the South Waterfront Plan, for instance, it was the first one where we really tried to do a green district and have a better connection to the waterfront. How we tried to do that evolved over time, but that was the first time we ever really tried to do that. The 88 plan didn't have much of that in it, but now the 2035 plan has a lot of things looking at sustainability. So it just shifts over time, and what we'll find is, boy, we put a lot of emphasis into incenting those types of things. It's 10 years later, now we have new challenges. We may decide we don't care about those things as much anymore. They're not it's not a priority enough that we want to invest in that. Now we want to shift to something else. But it's hard to change the ship of state that quickly. And so there's really no easy way to accommodate that. I think right now we would say we're really down on affordable housing at all levels. And then I think when we say we said affordable housing, when I started the city 20 years ago, we were talking about below 80% MFI or 60% MFI, which even then we were close to 50% of the units in some districts were affordable at that rate. The Pearl district, especially, which is funny because everyone always thinks it's such a tiny district. It had the majority of affordable housing in the state of Oregon. But are we still keeping up with that? No, we're losing ground on that. We're losing ground in a lot of areas right now.
hey, Michelle, this is Tyler Bump from the panel. One sort of data piece and reporting measure that I think the city's done a really good job with is the Portland Plan Measures of Success. The city does evaluate those and update their progress on an ongoing basis. And there are equity measures in the Portland Plan that have specific data points associated with them. So that is where I think the city's done a really good job of updating those on an ongoing basis. The Portland Plan is more of a strategic plan, which is a little bit higher level, but the city's done a good job of updating those. Oftentimes, I will say, I work all over the country. We have set a lot of goals, and very rarely do we revisit our progress to those goals. And so I'm in a lot of conversations of, well, you said you would do this 10 years ago. Have you done this? A lot of people are just kind of shrug, like, I don't know, have we done this? And so I think having an ongoing process to do that analysis and understand where we've come and where investments have happened and haven't happened needs to happen more often, frankly. It just doesn't happen as often as it should.
Like, for instance, the Portland Development Commission used to do an annual report on the state of housing in Central City. So we would know. It was harder based on the tenure of housing, whether it was, ownership or rental, but we had a pretty good idea of the number of units that were built. We had a pretty good idea of the type of units that were being built and the affordability of them. We're not there's various people who are keeping tabs of how we're doing housing, but there's not one comprehensive report anymore that comes out on the central city. So it's harder to keep tabs of that type of thing. We need to go back.
Actually, I just want to jump in. Portland Housing Bureau actually does publish a state of housing for the city of Portland. It's an annual report that comes out, and the last one is just on the website as well. So at least I know for housing, we cover sort of the state of housing. And it does look at every single neighborhood that is in the city, not just the downtown core. I'm not sure about some of the other metrics that are in, for example, our 2035 comp plan. I think part of this is the way we sort of have certain metrics. Different bureaus are responsible for meeting those particular metrics. And that does make maybe a little bit more challenging for folks like yourself who are trying to understand where do I find those metrics? Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in. I just wanted to make sure I mentioned about that.
Yeah, and I think I do realize that report comes out. I think it's some of the metrics that we were looking at in the past historically, we're not getting as much out of those. That's some of the other things we're trying to get a better handle on. Because one of the things we want to figure out too is if we are not meeting. So one of the things that's come up a lot is this, I've been working a lot on family compatible housing, and we really want to get a better sense of what's the unit mix going on. It's pretty challenging for us to keep track of that, and we've tried to work with, and that's an inter-bureau issue with the city. It's no one else's fault but our own, but we're just trying to keep track of when permits are coming in, what exactly is being built, and trying to keep record of that, and then spread that out to everyone else. Because right now, all that comes into the Bureau of Development Services. We don't really know though at the end, what is the final unit mix that's happening? What's the size of those units as well? It would give us a better idea of, boy, we're not really hitting this type of unit. We need to be putting better incentives out there to try to achieve that. So we're operating a little bit blind in some of those areas, but we have policies that say we're trying to achieve certain unit mixes or certain types, and that's where it falls apart.
Thanks.
On Blaze.
Blaze?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Hi, I'm Blaze Lewis. I'm a PSU undergrad student, urbanist, and my question is, you guys were briefly talking about how there's a housing shortage kind of across the board throughout Portland, not just the metro area. And it's kind of just a very brief question. Oregon's very unique with the DLCD's urban growth boundary. Do you believe that fixing and expanding the urban growth boundary will help alleviate some of the housing challenges that you guys face right now? Or do you want to work within the urban growth boundary that you have established right now and just try to increase density?
So the question has to do with the kind of overall shortage of housing units and the relationship with the urban growth boundary. And yeah.
Can't do a housing panel without bringing UGB up.
Well, from the affordable housing perspective, I have never challenged the validity of the UGB as being a barrier to affordable housing production, but we are a developer that's very much focused in the Portland metro region, and we want to locate housing close to transit and other amenities that you find predominantly within the UGB. So I think, naturally where it would come up is land prices, right? And if there would be some benefit to expanding the UGB and making land more available at lower price points within an affordable housing context. I think we have enough land availability within the UGB. And for me, the question is more around bringing resource to what we do have available, so we're not losing sight of connections to those other amenities that the metro region enables access to.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in for just a second to see if I can help address some of your questions, Blaze. We did a survey It's not, whole market. It's just a survey of our recent developments. And, most of the housing that the Portland Housing Bureau funds have an average of about, I would say between 70 to maybe 150 units. It's usually a stick-built 4-story building, probably on about a half an acre or half a city block, maybe 1 city block, so somewhere around there. And what we found is, on average, the average cost, if you allocate the cost of land, just a straight up cost of land on a per unit basis, it's about, it was under $25,000 per unit. It seems like it's a lot, but when you look at an average cost of, you can call it project, a unit these days in the city of Portland, across the range of sizes. So if you go for like studios, it's a lot cheaper than say a 3-bedroom. But the average, it's about, I would say right now, running about 450, maybe close to 500,000 a unit. That's for affordable housing. So you can say, well, affordable housing, we had some soft costs that needed to be taken off, that in a market rate, you don't have it. So maybe that's $50,000 per unit. You're still talking about $25,000 on an average cost of a building of about $400,000 to $450,000. So it's about 5 to 10% of the total cost. So I'm not sure if I would say that breaks the, call it the back of a camel, but I'm not sure if my colleagues on the panel have additional thoughts on this too.
Blaze, I don't know if you've checked out, another resource, another statewide study that's happening is the Oregon Housing Needs Assessment process that DLCD's leading, where they are looking at regions throughout the state and identifying housing production, underproduction, and targets, and what that looks like within the Oregon state land use system. The state's very diverse, and there's different housing needs in different contexts across the state. And I do think that there's probably some regional decisions around land capacity and land availability in the state that need to happen again. But certainly there's enough capacity in the central city. Like in the central city, if you think about the central city, we're talking about a development type, a housing type, predominantly multifamily rentals at this point in time. In the central city, predominantly steel and concrete tower construction, some 5/2 podium scale development that happens. Most of that is going to happen within the existing UGB just because of densities and infrastructure availability. So there is a sort of density product type role in the central city within the market, where it's just really hard to think about meeting that demand elsewhere in the region for that product type. So it's a complicated topic, but I would point you towards the ONA, Oregon Housing Needs Assessment report too. There's a lot of good information there.
Hi. Yeah, I've actually met the people running that at DLCD, primarily Sean. And yeah, they had a lot of really interesting things they brought up. One of the challenges that really stuck in my head was land that would be good for housing, but then, like you mentioned, subterranean infrastructure like sewage just not being possible. So very unique challenges. Thank you for all your answers, by the way. It's great being here.
So hi, I'm Deborah Sheridan. I'm taking urban planning with the first. I guess the panel was talking about how we don't really see, like, we see a bifurcation between affordable housing and market rate housing, and how in downtown we see a lot of like studios, 1-bedroom, and I guess that I don't know like what the typical housing capacity of market rate unit looks like how many bedrooms it has, or like how much square footage it has, but like are we seeing like a lack of like middle capacity housing, like our developers not like developing as much like say like 2 or 3 bedroom apartments that aren't inexpensive high rise, or like maybe apartments that have rooms that are a bit smaller, like I guess I'm curious about like what the incentives to developers to design housing in certain ways.
So the question, yeah, has to do with the particularly it sounds like the private market development that's happening in the central city, and the types of units that we're seeing, and whether they, like, how does that design process work? How are the choices made? And are we actually meeting what we need to see? I might be adding that in, but in the central city area.
I can help answer your question a little bit. For a 2 or 3 bedroom unit, the achievable rent on a per square foot basis for a larger unit is much further away from what is achievable rent on a per square foot basis for a 1 bedroom or a studio unit. So that is to say, for every square foot equivalent in a studio or a 2 or 3 bedroom, you're getting less rents on the revenue side on the 2 and 3 bedroom. And that is just an algebra problem that causes most of our multifamily market to go towards studio and 1 bedrooms. There is, I think, some ability to think about some incentives to close that feasibility gap, because it's not as huge as going to like a 60% AMI or more rent restricted, regulated, affordable housing type of unit. But it's predominantly a function of that gap between a per square foot rent for a studio and 1 bedroom versus a 2 or 3 bedroom. That's a really good question.
But it's something we're gonna have to figure out a way to close the gap on, because as noted, we're trying to accommodate 30% of the city's growth in 3% of the land area, the second city.
Yeah.
I don't see how we do that and create very livable neighborhoods and cohesive, kind of sustainable community structures in our neighborhoods in the central city if we still are only building those two unit types. That's where we struggle.
The only 2 and 3 bedroom unit types in the central city, non-regulated sort of market rate, or sometimes less expensive market rate housing that exists that I've seen, are either very high cost, expensive, larger condos that are typically upper floor sort of premium units in new construction. There's some older sort of 50s, 60s era 2 to 3 bedroom units, mostly down in the Halpern sequence sort of pedestrian pathway around Harrison Towers, that sort of thing. And then in the development that's underneath the Broadway Bridge over along the waterfront too. So there's very few places in the central city where you actually see 2 and 3 bedroom units. Most of it's older, very little besides newer construction, very, very expensive, larger units of condo projects.
And we tried to get ahead of that problem a little bit in the North Pearl plan. So what we did is we tried to put a new residential bonus in play that was for family compatible housing, 2 and 3 bedroom units. But what we did is we capped it in terms of the size. So we weren't going to give you a bonus for doing a penthouse, which they would have loved, but we weren't going to do that. So we basically took the social housing requirements that Vancouver, BC had developed for their affordable family housing and just converted it from metric to English. And it was doing okay. We had two projects actually respond to those incentives in the Pearl, but they were gutted once we had to get rid of our incentive program.
Unfortunately, I've gotten the signal that we're approaching the end of our time for today. So I just wanted to say thank you to the audience for all the fantastic questions, to Cy for organizing this panel, or to the whole set of panels, and to my panelists for a fantastic conversation. I think it will be the start of many additional conversations around this topic, and I'm very much looking forward to engaging with all of you around that.
I heard an additional element in the first question. In relation to the urban growth boundary. Henry George's 1880 notion of land value taxation. Tax land inside the boundary much more heavily than buildings. Try to get a handle on speculation, decrease the amount of speculative behavior that was occurring in the land market, especially in the context of a UGB, and then do the opposite on the other side of the line. And when the original urban growth boundary and regional planning was happening during the 1970s, the regional planners then argued vociferously, because they had just done something like that in Minneapolis. They did something in Minneapolis, St. Paul, that related to it, regional tax-based sharing, to try to get a handle on the competition between local governments to attract commercial, industrial investment, higher income households. So they wanted that kind of anti-speculative behavior to try to reduce a potential cost increasing impact on constraining the supply of land. Just interesting stuff that's been going on for a long time. So, yes, thanks very much to Matthew, panel members. A very, very stimulating discussion, a sobering discussion, but very, very stimulating, very illuminating. And yes, a role for Portland's Urban University in convening, hosting, supporting the kinds of conversations that are now and will increasingly be critical in the years ahead. So thank you all very, very much.